Hello, good evening, everybody. We'll give everyone just a few minutes to join in. Happy to have you here, though. Fred, will you be using a dictaphone this evening?
Yeah, and absolutely. In fact, I remember my father had one of those.
Really?
And yeah, I can remember that technology. We thought it was so cool and state of the art, and you know, come a long way.
For sure, exactly. It's incredible. You can make a movie and dictate and write it all on this thing right here, obviously. But
I know.
Good evening, everybody. As you're beginning to join the webinar for this evening, we're happy to have you, and we're just going to give everyone just a couple of minutes to settle in. We've got a good, decent amount of participants and audience members tonight. We're very excited to be spending time with you. We'll just give everyone just a few minutes, and thanks for holding tight. Appreciate it.
I'm admiring your megalopolis, your metropolis, I should say, poster there, Jeffrey. Have you had that for a while?
A long time, Fred, and I am looking forward to hopefully maybe we'll see it in the Westdale when we.
Yeah, I would love to show that up on the big screen. I'm afraid to show that on a digital. It would be too frustrating for people to watch that on their computers or television sets. But
have you seen it on a large screen before?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I saw that when I was in school, and it certainly fits into this film noir, genre, but not one we'll be discussing because it just didn't seem suitable.
I was at the Cinémathèque Française in Paris a number of years ago, and they have the costume of Maria.
Oh, really?
In the location. It's incredible. Thanks, everyone, for being so patient. We're going to get started here in just a couple of minutes. But while we're waiting for people to join, just a couple of quick housekeeping things I wanted to bring up is you can see a couple of options. There's a Q&A option. If you scroll down and just highlight the bottom of your screen with your mouse or your cursor, and as we go through this evening, during Fred's talk, if you have any questions or thoughts or comments you wish to share, please throw it in the Q&A. I will be keeping an eye on that. By the way, hello, my name is Jeff Bender, and I will be helping drive this evening as we see your comments and hear Fred's talk. Afterwards, Fred's going to be talking, what do you think, Fred, about roughly 30 to 35 minutes?
I'm never really sure, so bear with me. It's not that well organized.
No. So whenever Fred begins to wrap up his talk, then what we'll do is we'll open it up for the questions. But as the talk occurs, if things come to your mind, feel free to put it in the Q&A, and I'll keep an eye on it for sure. I also wanted to give you a heads up that this evening's talk will also be recorded, so that full disclosure that we are able to utilize that in the future for those that were not able to attend or wish to use this for future utilization. So I think, Fred, we're probably good to go ahead and get started.
Sure, let's get started.
Just wanted to say a big welcome to all of you that have taken the time this evening to join us. This is actually the Westdale's first film series talk of 2021, so very exciting. And it is a topic that obviously a lot of you are very excited to get into and talk about, and that is film noir. Over the course of the next several weeks, we have 5 different films that we will be offering as part of this series. And that's about all I have to say about it. If you want to find out more about this, obviously you know where the westdale.ca is because you're here tonight. So I'd like to pass it over to Mr. Fred Fuchs as our host. And Fred, take it away.
Well, welcome everyone. I assume, as Jeff said, you are familiar with the Westdale, but if you're not, we're a charitable organization in Hamilton. We bought the Westdale Theater and restored it 2 years ago. In fact, we're just coming up to our second anniversary, February 14th of opening. And we're an independent cinema and also an arts and culture venue. And obviously, you know, with the pandemic going on, we've had to close the theater. So we moved a lot of our programming online, and we have film clubs and other activity. And if you are interested, please, you know, take a look at our website and you can find out about everything. And, you know, I'm the chair of the Westdale, but my background was as a movie producer. I lived in California for many years and was involved in the film industry, and also had the good fortune of, when I was in university, that although I wasn't a film major, I did study and watch a lot of movies. And I was actually an American Studies major, which is a sort of a bit of a newish major at the time, because it's the study of the history through popular culture, not through intellectual history. And of course, film noir was something we studied because not just as a film genre, but it's quite fascinating to see how it fits into the tradition of American pop culture mythology and how it represented the culture of the time. So at different points throughout these talks, I may refer to this because I think it's always interesting to try to have the context of what happened, what was happening in America at the time these films was made. By the way, there are other film noir. There are European film noir. We're going to talk a little bit about German expressionistic films, but the focus of this series will be, you know, American Hollywood film noir movies. Film noir, of course, is a, you know, kind of you know, it's a descriptive term that was first coined by the French critics in the post-war period. And it was a response to what they seemed to think of as a, Jeffrey, can you just hold that for a second, please? I'm sorry. And they thought it was, they were responding to what seemed to them as a distinctly darkened tone to American cinema that evolved near the end of the war and then on into the post-war. And this style of filmmaking is often characterized by such elements as cynical heroes and stark lighting effects and frequent use of flashbacks and intricate plots and sort of in general, an underlying existentialist philosophy. And it, you know, very prevalent in crime drama. And they were both Hollywood studio film noirs, like the one we're going to see. And then there was also a whole genre of sort of B film kind of film noirs that were made as well. One of the most important, and remember, this was a period in the 40s that reflected a lot of the disillusionment that was felt in the country towards the end of the war. The soldiers were returning home. A lot of them had PTSD, though they didn't know what PTSD was in those days. Women were losing their jobs at the end of the war. Remember, this was the 40s, it was an amazing time for women because suddenly their labor was very valuable. They were out in the workforce. So the film noirs very much mirror that sort of urban malaise and the social anxieties of the 1940s and 50s. And you'll see that reflected on all of these, in all of these films. Many often anti-hero protagonists, first person narrative, of course, the great Femme Fatales, and that taut kind of no nonsense dialogue, all of which we've already seen, you know, in Double Indemnity before this screening. Now, the early antecedents of film noir were certainly the German expressionist films of the 1920s. If you could put up slide one, this included great films like Nosferatu, which is the one you're looking at the moment. This was, you know, one of the great films by a director named Murnau, The Cabin of Dr. Caligari, Metropolis, Fritz Lang, M, and you know, it was sort of an experimental sensibility of the time, and again, very high key cinematography, bright direct light, off-kilter camera angles. It's very funny because those became referred to in Hollywood as Dutch angles, but there was nothing Dutch about them. They were Deutsch angles, which means German angles, but often people refer to them as Dutch angles, these off-camera camera angles. And then of course, you know, strange compositions to emphasize these spooky and sordid storylines, you know. And what was particularly interesting about this period to me was how what was emerging in terms of literature in America at the time were these sort of pulp fiction writers like Dashiell Hammett with Maltese Falcon, of course, James Cain, who was the novelist who wrote Double Indemnity, and of course the famous Raymond Chandler, who wrote The Big Sleep and many other. And in fact, of course, Raymond Chandler was the screenwriter, the co-screenwriter of Double Indemnity with Billy Wilder. And we'll get to how that happened. But so it was only a matter of time between the noir filmmakers directed their lenses to this very, very fitting merger between the crime fiction and psychological thriller storylines of these pulp fiction stories that often first appeared, in magazines, as serials before. So what a perfect moody aesthetic elements joined together became very popular in cinema. And of course, James Cain, he didn't really like that terminology of, pulp fiction and hard-boiled crime writers, but he was very much one of them. In fact, he was originally a newspaper reporter, as many writers were, including, by the way, Billy Wilder first started as a newspaper reporter. And he attended a execution of a woman. This was in the 1930s, who was very much the inspiration for this story. And she indeed had cooked up murdering her husband, and there was an insurance scandal, and he attended her execution. And what happened, there was a picture taken of the execution. Someone had smuggled the camera in, and it was actually, became a big deal because before that, no one had actually had an image of an execution taking place. So, this was something Cain remembered, and he certainly took his time. But by the mid-30s, he did create this story, Double Indemnity. He also is the writer, of course, of The Postman Rings Twice. Am I saying that right, Jeffrey?
Yeah, The Postman Always Rings Twice.
The Postman Always Rings Twice, which of course also became a famous movie. But when this book first came out, or when this story first came out, nobody really felt they could do anything with it. And remember, this was now in the mid-30s, and they thought this was just going to be too dark a story. And of course, the original book was even darker and then the movie that you watched. And what happened was it sort of languished for a while. By the way, other books that he wrote included Mildred Pierce, which was made in 1941. So of course he was quite well known. So nevertheless, eventually this story did get into the hands of Paramount Studios, and they decided to try in 1944 to try to make a movie of it. And this was also, because, there was sort of, remember, this was a period when the production code was very strong in Hollywood. And this was a censorship that was self-imposed by the studios themselves, because they were very concerned about the moral values of the public. They were very concerned, and there were very strong lobbyist groups and the church, obviously, who could really affect their audiences. So everything was scrutinized very carefully. And many of the changes that happened in this movie and many movies had to do with working around the restrictions of this production code, because they read the scripts before they were even made. They would watch the cut, they would make requirements. We have, ratings as we think of them now, PG-13 and R and X, but this was much, much deeper involvement and affected many movies, and particularly, the film noir movies. So although Cain never wrote any original screenplays, there were 13 films that were made based on his fictional writing, right? So you can, just to give you a perspective of, of what was happening again with the power of this kind of storytelling. And it was very, very interesting to me. And one of the things that, of course, that Cain tried to describe as what he does is, I merely try to write as the character would write. I never forget that the average man from the fields, the streets, the bars, and the offices, and even the gutters of his country has acquired a vividness of speech that goes beyond anything I could invent. And that if I stuck to this heritage of this logos of the American countryside, I would attain a maximum of effectiveness with very little effort. That was actually in the preface of Double Indemnity. So anyhow, so this is really where it came about. And eventually it was brought to Billy Wilder. And one of the very interesting things that happened is Billy Wilder was gaining quite a bit of respect as a screenwriter. He had emigrated from Germany in the 30s. Of course, he actually was involved in the German expressionist film, silent films, and wrote titles. And this is how he first started as a writer. So he was very familiar with that genre, and he had worked with those directors at the time. So he always had he had an understanding of this. And even though film noir as a genre had not been established, he was very kind of suited to bring these two different factors together, these pulp fiction stories and this very expressionistic film style. And he had been writing with a partner named Charles Brackett, and they had been very successful. They had written some very good movies, mostly comedies. He had written movies for Ernst Lubitsch, of course. He had also done some wonderful Ball of Fire that Howard Hawks directed, which actually starred Barbara Stanwyck, and that's how they first met. And so he was getting a point where he was going to be able to direct. And he had actually directed one or two movies as well, Five Graves to Cairo, and I believe one other, but this was one of his very early directorial efforts. However, his writing partner, Charles Brackett, refused to work on this project. He thought this material was just beneath him and was too sordid and really had no interest in it at all, which turned out to be a great blessing for this film, because instead Billy Wilder turned to Raymond Chandler, the great fiction detective writer, to partner with him and to write this, to write this screenplay. Chandler's first novel was The Big Sleep. It was published in 1939. He only published about 7 novels, but almost every single one of them became a movie, including Farewell, My Lovely, The Little Sister, The Long Goodbye. And he was happy or intrigued to take this job working with Billy Wilder because, he thought this would be interesting to see how he could, what he could do on a film. And actually James Cain was approached, but was actually working on another film. He wasn't even available. So Chandler turned out to be a perfect person to be working with Wilder, even though they absolutely hated each other. They had a horrible relationship. They worked very closely together, but Chandler, really provided much of the dialogue, that is so memorable in this film and just kind of has this, incredible resonance to it. So, Wilder would sort of guide the structure and then, kind of give scenes to Chandler to write. And in fact, most of what, was largely Chandler, and much of the dialogue was actually quite different from the original novel, right? And the emotional basis of this story is kind of very interesting and very typical of these pulp fictions. Of course, the whole story is told as a flashback, right? And which gives this wonderful poignancy as we see our lead, Fred MacMurray, talking, into this dictaphone and relating what happened and how it happened, because it immediately puts you kind of in the character's point of view. And all the scenes that take place, of course, we're now sort of watching and experiencing through his eyes, even though, and knowing, of course, that something's going to go terribly wrong, right? So although, we kind of know what the ending might be, we don't know how we're going to get there. And this was very much kind of a formula that was done quite a bit, during these times. So in fact, one of the big challenges of working with Chandler was that he was an alcoholic. And although he was not drinking during the beginning of this, this relationship together, he soon took to drinking and created a huge problem for both of them. But coincidentally, consequence. But appropriately, it stayed with Wilder, and his next film that Wilder did after this film was a movie called The Lost Weekend, which is a Best Picture winner with Ray Milland. It's the story of an alcoholic and a binge. And Billy Wilder certainly was drawing upon, I believe, his experiences with Raymond Chandler in creating this movie, right? And of course, there were many changes, as I said, to the original story. There was, in fact, there was a whole different ending that was shot, which we'll talk about. But, this is normal process as we go through this. Billy Wilder, I don't think, again, there's too much we need to say about him, except his wonderful, writing. And then, of course, he went on to do, such fantastic directing and won, although he did not win Academy Awards for this movie, he certainly won Academy Awards for many other great movies and also did some other film noir. And of course, the most famous being Sunset Boulevard, right? So many of the conventions of film noir were set during this film. The photographer was John Seitz, who was Paramount's top, photographer. Remember, at the studio, everybody was under contract. So you had available to you these fantastic craftsmen, and the craftsman is, of course, beautiful. But things like the Venetian blind lighting, which you see again and again. We'll look at some shots of this, and the plots were all very, trend-setting in terms of what was going to happen. And people were looking at films at this time that, and certainly there are stylistic elements of Citizen Cain from 1941 and narrative elements of The Maltese Falcon, and sort of bringing this all together, really created something quite dramatic. And of course, beyond this fantastic script, there was this unbelievable cast because, the way this dialogue comes out of their mouths, the way the characters are able to be embodied and create flesh and blood, very kind of empathetic and relatable characters, is really a tribute to just fantastic actors. And I think we have to start, of course, with Barbara Stanwyck, who, of course, is one of my favorite actors of all time. And sometimes I feel a little underappreciated. She actually never won an Academy Award during her lifetime. She got an honorary award later. And she was just an extraordinary character. Her real name is Ruby Stevens. She grew up an orphan from the wrong side of the tracks. Her older sister, took her out of the foster home and took her to New York, and she became a dancer and dancing in speakeasies. And, she was a Ziegfeld Folly girl at 16, and she knew how to move. In fact, remember, this is when, when she started working, sound had just entered into filming, and she was really someone who knew how to move with the camera and work with the camera. And she just worked so hard and continued to grow her capacity, as an actress. She could, she of course was well known for being this woman of the world, sophisticated and ruthless and, very attractive, independent woman in a man's world. One of her first films was Lady of Leisure, directed by Frank Capra. She was only 23 years old, and this was pre-code. So this is, if you want to see something about, what these kinds of movies were like before they were being censored, that's something worth watching. But she had incredible range. She was very intelligent but somehow, warmer and tougher, and people would compare her to Joan Crawford, but in my mind, she was a much greater actor. One of her first Academy Award nominations before this was for a film called Stella Dallas. I don't know if you guys know that film, but an incredible performance. So Wilder knew her, of course, from the film that he wrote, Ball of Fire, which is a screwball comedy. And of course, she had already done The Lady Eve, which is probably one of the great comedic performances of all time in Hollywood, a Preston Sturges movie. And by the time she made this movie at 37, she was at 37 years, she was the highest paid actress in Hollywood. Not just in Hollywood, she was the highest paid woman in America in 1944. And she was very worried about doing this movie because, of course, the script and the character is what it is. And Wilder finally sat down and said to her, "Are you an actress or a mouse?" And that's when she finally agreed to do it, you know. So what an incredible performance, and we'll talk a little bit about more about it later. But but the one very funny part, of course, is that the blonde wig that she's wearing throughout the movie, which was Billy Wilder's idea. And after shooting for a couple of weeks, they finally realized it looked so bad, and they wanted to go reshoot the earlier scenes, and it was too late. And then later, Wilder claimed he did the bad looking wig was intentional, but I'm sure you all noticed it, right? But of course, here's a character that really turned the American dream, which I'm sure every door-to-door salesman had of, opening the door and finding this beautiful woman who, seduces him, but really turned it on its head. Now, the casting of Fred MacMurray was equally extraordinary. He was successful at the time, but really doing light comedy. He had started as a musician and a singer, but he was also one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. He was the fourth highest paid man in America. And he was not the first choice. Many people were approached: Alan Ladd, George Raft, Spencer Tracy, Gregory Peck, Frederick March. They all passed on the role of Walter Neff. But somehow Wilder was able to convince MacMurray to do this part, completely different from anything else he had ever done. And of course, the result was extraordinary. For me, and I think for many of us who, my age at least, who remember Fred MacMurray from the Disney films, Absent-Minded Professor, of course, the great TV series, My Three Sons, that was very much the character that MacMurray was known by at the public. So although he hesitated, taking on this role, he did. And then, of course, many years later, Wilder convinced him to take on not an unsimilar role, to play the cheating executive Sheldrake in The Apartment, the great 1960 movie with Shirley MacLaine and Jack Lemmon. And MacMurray, of course, also was a greatly loved Hollywood character. And he actually purchased the MacMurray Ranch up in Sonoma, which was an early vineyard and still very, very successful vineyard. And then the third star, of course, is Edward G. Robinson. And Edward G. Robinson was a major movie star, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. But this was a point, and of course, Little Caesar and many other great gangster movies, Academy Award winner. And he was quite reluctant to take on this part because, of course, he's really the third lead, and he had never, played anything other than the lead. But he finally accepted that he was in this transitional phase in his career. And then, of course, they agreed to pay him as much as they were paying Stanwyck and MacMurray for doing a lot less work. So he finally agreed and said, let's do it. So let's talk about the film a little, and we're going to show a few slides while we do it. The opening credits are quite interesting. We have this wonderful image of this silhouette of a man on crutches, right? And the credits are playing over this, and we don't know what exactly we're looking at. Here's some guy limping along on crutches. Why? It's a silhouette. It's mysterious. It's he's a broken man. But what is this? But very interesting way to kind of engage us and first get us into the story, right? And then very shortly after, we see this limping man get to his office in slide 4. And he starts to tell this story. And look at this guy, he's sweating, he's obviously in pain. But there's this incredible need to confess, right? This is a confession of sorts, right? And he's gonna try to tell us this story. And of course, who is he confessing to? He's confessing to the Edward G. Robinson character, Keyes, who very much is sort of a fatherly figure to Neff. And there's very much a father-son story going on here. And you can just, the guilt, the tension is just oozing out of this character. And it's quite extraordinary. And in fact, you can see it's done in a close-up. And one of the things you might have noted in this film is there aren't an abundance of close-ups. And that's because back in those days, of course, the films were being shown on the big screen, and there wasn't this need for close-ups all the time to portray emotion. And close-ups, of course, are so important because it draws attention to the character, but more importantly, you get to see their eyes. And so much of an actor's performance is through their eyes and you know, the windows to your soul. And of course, on a big screen in a two-shot, you still have that bigger than life capacity to experience that. Of course, on television, it's much more difficult to do. And of course, in modern day, you know, you see the use of close-ups, you know, much more prevalent and done all the time. And if you noticed in this film, they were done very, very sparingly and very particular time. Often scenes played in long tracking shots, two shots, walking through, you know, the office or other places. But here we have this fantastic close-up and again, setting up this story, totally going to be told in flashback, but we certainly know that something very dramatic is about to happen. And then, of course, you know, we start with meeting Phyllis for the first time, and that's slide 5. And here she is in a towel. I mean, you know, what door-to-door salesman doesn't want the lady of the house to show up naked in a towel, right? So this was, you know, again, the code, you could do this, but there was an enormous amount of argument about how big the towel needed to be. And as you can see, it's quite a large towel because there was, you know, this was the kind of conversation that used to go on. They would, you know, worry about how large the towel would be. But what a great seductive shot. What a great time and a great place to meet Phyllis, our femme fatale. And, you know, I don't know, you know, how much the blonde wig bothered everybody. I thought it was kind of weird and sort of off-putting, but at the same time, maybe was somehow, you know, symbolic of the character herself, you know. And anyhow, it's certainly not the Barbara Stanwyck we're used to seeing in many of her other films. In the next slide, slide 4, we start to see the use of this, you know, Venetian blinds shot, which is so prevalent in all the film noir, not just film noir. I mean, obviously, you've seen this Venetian blind lighting in so many films, but this was really one of the first films that actually emphasized that Venetian blind lighting. And in fact, John Seitz, who the photographer, actually did some very clever things. And Billy Wilder himself was a bit of an inventor. And they actually were able to, you know, put a bunch of, I forget what they actually used, but something in the air to actually help, you know, emphasize this. It wasn't, you know, these days we use smoke a lot to do that, but in those days they actually put some kind of particles in the air to help emphasize this light.
I don't know how healthy it was, Fred, but they used an aluminum filing of some type.
Aluminum filings, that's what I was trying to remember. Yes, they used aluminum filings to help create this atmosphere in the air. And you're right, I don't think they were terribly worried at the time about the impact on the health of everybody. But again, you know, an incredible shot and really sets up everything for us. And then if we can move on to slide 7, well, this is, of course, the great seduction scene. And as you'll notice, and of course they refer to, she's wearing this famous anklet bracelet, right? Now, the story, of course, is that at the time, there was an urban legend. Now, you guys know what urban legends are. You know, obviously, we hear about them all the time these days. But even back then, there were urban legends. And the urban legend was that if you were a married woman and you wore an anklet bracelet, it meant you were available, that you were, you know, available for, you know, non-marital sex or affairs or something. So although this is something that some of the audience probably did know in terms of this urban legend, whether it's true or not, I have no idea. It was very, very specifically used in this scene to great dramatic effect. And you can, you know, certainly see it in MacMurray's eyes as he's just, you know, drooling over this potentially available married woman, though, you know, what was to happen, he had no idea. But of course, this might have inspired him to some of that incredible dialogue, that sexual banter that took place in this scene about, you know, speed limits and you're driving too fast. And all of that dialogue is classic Raymond Chandler dialogue. You could imagine his character, the detective Philip Marlowe, saying these lines. And of course, Stanwyck, you know, just played it to the T. In fact, you know, if you remember, as she's coming down the stairs, she's still buttoning her dress. You you button your dress before you come down the stairs, unless you have an intention as to why you want to wait and button your dress as you're walking down the stairs. So, you know, this was, she surely had, you know, we find out, of course, she had a plan. We find out this is ultimately this incredibly deceivious woman who in fact had, you know, murdered her husband's wife when she was her nurse, and then took her place. I mean, you know, this is a femme fatale for the ages. But anyhow, slide 8, we finally meet Robinson as Barton Keyes, or Keyes, I'm sorry, I don't remember his first name. And Keyes, of course, is, Robinson's just an amazing actor. He brought so much to this part. We love the little business with the cigars, of course, and he never has a match. And, you know, and his son, MacMurray, has to always light the cigar for him until, of course, the very end. Lots of little nuances. You know, what was so remarkable about Wilder and these directors is they told stories with images. You know, of course, there was great dialogue all the time, but it was all of these little nuances and these visual image touches that really made their films stand out. And I attribute a lot of that to the fact that they all started in the silent movie industry. And they knew that silent movies, you didn't have a choice. You had to tell it with images. So they really focused on that. Of course, here, you know, they have everything going, and it's just such a layered, you know, scene. I mean, I've seen this movie probably at least 10 times, and every time I watch it, I see things I'd never seen before. So anyhow, let's go on. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is in their apartment, and of course, this is sort of post-sex. Now, of course, you're not allowed to show any sex in movies in those days, but clearly, you know, we had them have a kiss. Clearly, she's what is she doing? Retouching her makeup. You know, I think we all understand, you know, what's happened. And of course, very intense moment. MacMurray is sort of, you know, lounging and just, you know, I don't know what, but, you know, I wouldn't call this romantic, but there certainly was a lot of passion and a lot of intensity to this relationship. And I think you can certainly feel it. So let's see, the next one is slide 9. Oh, slide 9. Okay, so this is a great example of a close-up, right? So where's this close-up, of course, and just look at her eyes. Well, this is, of course, during the famous, during the murder, right? So, you know, we know what's going on. We know that Neff is hid in the back seat and, you know, and he's about to kill this guy. But we never see any of the violence. We never see any of the killing take place. The entire scene plays in this very enigmatic close-up of Barbara Stanwyck. And you can see, I don't know how to even describe it. And of course, we've all seen it on our television sets, but some of you who have seen it in the movie, and you look at the lighting and the drama of this shot, it really is very, very powerful. One thing that's very interesting about this, let's see, you actually have it in slide 11. Yeah, is that this was the little business that after the murder and after, remember, you know, Neff was on the train and they put the body on the tracks and they're about to take off and the car won't start. Well, the car won't start was an improv. That was not something that was in the script. That morning, Billy Wilder, you know, got in his car ready to go to work to shoot the scene, and his car wouldn't start. And being the clever director he was, he said, "Oh, I'm going to use this in the movie." So we have this wonderful tense movie. Moment is about they're about to drive off after leaving the body there on, and time is of the essence. And she can't get the car started. And finally, he reaches over and gets the car started. But it's just part of, you know, the movie magic that happens on a set, that as much as you plan everything, script everything, sometimes it's these kind of spontaneous moments that actually are as dramatic as anything else you could ever imagine. So let's look at slide 12. So this is a very interesting scene. Remember, this is now, we're at Neff's apartment, and of course, Phyllis has come to see him. But meanwhile, of course, Keyes is showing up, and Keyes is trying to piece together what's happened. And you know, what a crazy tension to have the murderess and his and his, you know, partner in crime. But isn't there something strange about that door? Well, it opens out into the hallway. Well, apartment doors, hotel doors, they don't open out into the hallway. The doors open into the house, right? You know, you never will see, you know, an apartment built this way. But of course, for the drama of this scene, which was obviously in the script and quite planned out, here she is hiding behind the door, which has no logical reason for ever opening this way, but worked beautifully to create this drama for this moment. Slide 13. This is, of course, one of several of these plotting scenes that take place at this drugstore, grocery store. Of course, these drugstores were very famous in Hollywood, and everybody knew, you know, the audience all knew where they were. And, you know, I don't know how conspicuous or not she is in those sunglasses, but clearly the dramatic tension of this moment is very powerful and very clear. And of course, you know, it's a very iconic scene where we begin to see their relationship starting to fray. And of course, wonderful dialogue, you know, very often throughout the scene, they talk about this idea of let's go, you know, straight down the line. We're going straight down the line, and there's no pulling out. And we're really just kind of waiting to see, in a way, who's going to double cross who first, because things don't smell right. It doesn't feel like this is going to end well. And of course, Neff is having cold feet. And of course, we do ultimately get to this great scene of the double cross in slide 14. Right? And this is set up so beautifully, because if you remember at the beginning of the scene, we watch Phyllis come into the room and we watch her hide the gun under the chair. So the audience, we're ahead of the game. We know there's a gun there. We know, because, you know, they haven't said anything. They haven't been clear. Neff hasn't said, you know, forget this, I'm leaving, I'm out, I don't want to do this anymore. But you know, Phyllis knew what was happening and she was well prepared. And when he does try to pull out on her, there it is, you know, there's the gun. And of course, she shoots him. And she wings him, I guess, in the shoulder, you know, and again, you know, maybe it was he lost so much blood or whatever, but, you know, it was good she didn't kill him. But then as he moves closer to her, it always puzzled me, why doesn't she take a second shot and finish him off? Right? Because she easily could. And everything we've learned about this character tells us that she should, but she doesn't. And, you know, again, do we really believe that somehow she's fallen in love with him and that, you know, that therefore she can't bring herself to kill him, even though, of course, she knows once he takes the gun away from her, he's going to kill her. I'm not sure. This is the one moment, I'm curious to hear what you guys think, but this is the one moment in the film that I felt sort of was emotionally false, you know, that I believe it may have had more to do with the production code and trying to satisfy them, and you know, to have her get away with the murder would obviously be completely unacceptable, but that's what happened. And then of course, there's the great final scene, slide 15. And it's in this final confession. And of course, here's, you know, Keyes lighting the cigarette for MacMurray, you know, how beautifully, you know, just touching little moments like that. And this scene was such a powerful scene and great way to end the film, but it wasn't the way the film was supposed to end. And in fact, they had already shot the scene where MacMurray's character goes to the gas chamber. They had shot a whole sequence, you know, about his execution, and that was going to be very important. And the production code wanted to have a scene because, of course, villains have to ultimately, you know, get their comeuppance. But once they shot this final scene between the two of them, they realized they could just leave they could leave him, you know, crumbled, you know, in the hallway, you know, and Keyes saying, you're never going to get away. You didn't need the gas chamber scene. And everybody was happy not to show that because that was somewhat gruesome, you know, and perhaps, you know, a little crazier than one would want to see. So the film, you know, was very well received. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, but it lost every single one. And the reason, and it lost it to another film at the period called Going My Way, which was the great Bing Crosby kind of film, you know, where he plays Father Francis, I think his name is. There was a sequel called The Bells of St. Mary. And Going My Way was the most successful box office movie of the year. And of course, it was Bing Crosby's great film. But what it was also made by Paramount. And in those days, most of the Academy members worked for the studios. And it was very political. And there was a lot of pressure from the studio executives to vote for the film they wanted you to vote for. And instead of, you know, this winning Best Picture, instead of Billy Wilder winning, you know, Best Director, it went to Leo McCarey, the director of Going My Way. Bing Crosby won for Best Actor, and Barbara Stanwyck didn't even win for Best Actress. The award went to Ingrid Bergman for a film called Gaslight. So quite sad, but he made up for it, Wilder, next year with Lost Weekend, and he won 4 Oscars. And McCary's Belle of St. Mary's only won 1. But Wilder was so pissed off that the story goes that as McCary was heading down the aisle to pick up his Oscar, Wilder stuck out his foot and tripped McCary, and he fell on the ground right on the red, you know, on the carpet before he got up there to win it. Anyhow, it was a terrific, you know, the way it was sold, you know, terrific story about unholy love and almost perfect crime. You know, you can't, from the moment they met, it was murder. You can't get across from murder, you know. It was really, you know, that kind of great movie that they really took advantage of this kind of, you know, popularity in the culture with these pulp fiction novels as well. And very, very, very exciting times. And one of the things, Wilder hated, you know, ads, and he didn't want to do trade paper ads. But he was very upset because Selznick was promoting a movie of his called Since You Went Away. So he did, you know, Double Indemnity are the 2 most important words in movies since Broken Blossoms, which was the great D.W. Griffith classic. And he was going to sue Wilder. And Alfred Hitchcock took out ads because he loved the film. He said the 2 most important words in the movies today are Billy Wilder. So anyhow, just I hope you guys loved this film as much as I did. It's a great, great one to kick off with. Obviously, some of the others are quite different, but this is often thought of as one of the great, you know, and for obvious reasons, one of the great, you know, film noirs. And of course, I want to leave some time for some questions and comments, and I hope you all had a chance to see it, and happy to listen to what everyone else has to say. And thank you for joining us.
Cool. Thanks, Fred. Great talk. Just wanted to remind folks that you can pop open the app at the bottom. You should see a Q&A option, and feel free to send your messages. Or if you also have a question, you can put up your hand and I'll get to you for sure. But in the meantime, we have a couple of questions there for you, Fred. And one of them is from Ken.
Can you take the slide off, please?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Ken asks, that, first of all, loving the talk already, he said. Why the change from Huff in the novel to Neff in the film?
Oh, and I keep confusing the 2, as you could hear during my talk. And that was simply a function of when they do every film, they have to do a search of, are there real people with those names? Because if there is a person with that name, you're not permitted to use it in a film. You are permitted to do it in books and in literature, but you're not permitted to do it in films or on television. So every script we write, every script that's written has to go through this kind of, you know, title search to see if are there any real individuals who have that name? And in this case, I believe there was one. So that's why they had to change the name.
And as a matter of fact, it was an insurance agent. So
yeah. He wouldn't have been happy.
No, I can imagine. We also have a question both from Lindy and Margarita, actually. They have some similar concerns about the fact that Mr. MacMurray was wearing a wedding ring on his finger.
Yes, that was a mistake. Your good eyes. That was an absolute mistake. They recognized it later on. MacMurray was married, and for some unbelievable reason, the wardrobe people and Wilder and nobody seemed to notice the wedding ring till later, and it was too late to do anything about it. But that wedding ring obviously should not have been there. That was a big mistake.
Any other questions that we may have? I've got a few myself as well.
Sure, go ahead, please.
Just wondering if you had any thoughts on the music from the film, or any comments.
Well, I think the music was good. You know, again, I would say it was certainly something that Wilder was not particularly known for. His great directorial sense of the whole, of the whole craft of filmmaking. He was very focused on dialogue. He was very focused on sort of performance. I don't know what to say. What did you think, Jeff? Because I thought the music was good, but I felt at times, again, it may have been almost too melodramatic. And maybe if it had been a little bit more subtle, it actually would have played just as well. I don't know.
When I think of film noir, I think of the score of Double Indemnity. I have those horns in my head, and it was a melodrama. That's in fact what they referred to them as before the terminology of film noir ever emerged. We have a handful of questions from our audience, though.
Keep going.
Jeffrey Eden. Good evening, Jeffrey. Great talk. Thanks. Along with the lighting and other technical expertise, I think Edith Head deserves a shout out for costumes.
She does. Edith Head was a great designer. She worked for Paramount. And Barbara Stanwyck was never someone who was really a glamorous woman. And she didn't, she wasn't Carole Lombard or Katharine Hepburn. And so clothing and that style was not intrinsically part of who she was. And this was really her first film where she embraced working closely with Edith Head. In fact, I had the pleasure of meeting Edith Head. I actually got to go to her house when I was a young man working in Hollywood, and I had to pick her up and take her to the Academy Awards because she was nominated. And this was 1977 or something. She was still working, what an extraordinary woman. But yes, this was not the actress. This was Edith Head. This was not Billy Wilder. This was the great costume designer coming up with these extraordinary outfits and very much influenced by the fashion of the day and the shoulder pads and things like that. And it really was an awakening for Barbara Stanwyck in terms of how important clothes could be. In fact, on her very next film, which we talked about in December, called Christmas in Connecticut, a comedy. This is the range of Stanwyck. She had just come off doing this movie in 1945. She insisted that Edith Head designed her clothes, even though she didn't do the movie, because she recognized how important it was. And I think that's a great comment. And thank you for noticing that. I'm sorry I didn't mention it, because it was a huge part of her character, and it really helped her as a performer to get into this character, to have the clothes that she did, and not just the ankle bracelet, but all the other pieces.
Thanks, Jeffrey, for asking. Deirdre Haskell asks, what do you think of the character Lola?
Well, I actually thought Lola was much more interesting this time than I ever did in the past. I don't know why. I sort of always saw her sort of this very minor role, but she actually has an important role in this film. And of course, it's through her we really understand, how awful this woman really is, and of course, and how she was responsible for Lola's mother's death, right? And of course, an innocent, and she's being, used in a way by this Cabetti or whatever his name was, right? Her boyfriend, who we later on find out is actually, living with Phyllis at the house, and once MacMurray wasn't or needed anymore. But I found Lola quite sympathetic and probably the only good person in the entire film. I guess Keyes is a good person too, and I think she added something very nice to it. And watching her interact with Fred MacMurray was was kind of nice. She created, at least some moral counterbalance to the rest of the unbelievable insidious stuff that was going on. So it was a good inclusion. I don't know, I can't recall if she's in the book or not, but I think she had a lot of value to, brought a whole nother texture to the story.
We have a comment from David Simpson, if I can read it. In the context of the movie, the crime is presented as very clever and thoughtfully planned, but it should have been fishy from the start. Not likely that a body just dropped on the tracks would have had the same sort of injuries as one that fell off a train. Also, I wasn't clear whether or not the victim smoked cigars or not. Was that established?
That's a good question. Now, obviously, you're right. This is not a sophisticated crime drama as we think of them today, and it's certainly not even from a novelistic point of view, Agatha Christie or, a well plotted and well thought through, certainly, if Hercules Poirot was around, he'd see through this in 2 seconds, and but in terms of the assumptions being that, they could get away with it, and the assumptions being that they're not professional murderers, and certainly, MacMurray, who's a dupe, who's being convinced to play along, so I think you're absolutely right, and of course, at the end of the day, it's a movie, and the audience isn't really all terribly concerned, and then they do kind of explain it a little, because of course, when Key starts to explore and investigate the case, and he's a sharp guy, the one thing he can't accept is that, his son and, protege, Neff is behind this or involved in this. He's blinded by his emotional relationship with this guy. And there are just fantastic moments in the scenes together when they bring back, the witness who was on the train. And you see in MacMurray's eyes this incredible guilt and suffering to have to watch his mentor, this brilliant man who he looked up to, be so blinded to the reality of it, because he has an emotional relationship and he's been betrayed. That's probably, as big a betrayal as anything in this film. And the power of that, I think, is beautifully portrayed. But you're right. It's hard to imagine how, strangling someone can look, if there was any kind of autopsy done and a coroner, how could that have happened from falling from a train? I don't know.
A little suspension of disbelief for these films.
Exactly.
But, it's all about the style. By the way, you mentioned earlier, Fred, the use of eyes and being able to see eyes in those close-ups. And I found Fred MacMurray uses his eyes so frequently throughout this movie, particularly when he finds out that Zacchetti is linked up with Phyllis. This look in his eyes of almost
pain. Yeah.
Pain and
it's great acting, and this is really what ultimately I think separated and made this film such a classic. It's not that it wasn't a good script. It was a great script. It's not that it was great lighting and great, and all that, and the structure and the plot. But at the end of the day, it really always comes down to the performances. And Wilder was not a great actor's director. Many were, who had studied acting themselves or were actors, but Wilder was not known as a great actor's director, but he was great at casting. And he got the cast he wanted for this film. And in fact, when you try to think about other people playing this part, like George Raft, I mean, this film could have gone very, very sideways. He was quite fortunate that he got the cast he did. He obviously knew he wanted Barbara Stanwyck from the beginning, but it was really the three of, and again, I wouldn't minimize, Edward G. Robinson's contribution to this movie. He brings so much energy and so much kind of just, it really propels us through a lot of plot stuff that otherwise might have sounded quite boring, but because he himself is such just, incredible character, interesting character, he can hold his own on the screen, and perhaps, somewhat one note part, But I completely, that's why, you know, again, one day, very soon, I hope the theater will be open again. We'll be showing these great classics and many others up on the big screen. Fortunately, a lot of them have been restored, and we have really good, you know, 2K DCPs. And the difference is pretty extraordinary. That's the way they were meant to be watched. But, you know, until then, we are fortunate. They are available. All of the other, you know, 4 films we're showing are available, readily available online. You know, if you haven't seen them, watch them on, try not to watch them on your computer if you can, watch them on a TV set. It does matter. And anyhow, you know, it's so much fun to revisit these films and to think about it. This film was made, you know, almost 80 years ago, 75 years ago. And I would say it stands up to any of drama being done today. In fact, you know, by the way, there are film noirs that have been done. And, you know, you can think of Chinatown as a film noir. You can think of some of the Coen brothers movies as film noir. You know, it's not that film noir as a genre has died. And of course, they're shot in color, you know, for the most part. But the influence of this genre is clear, was very clear and continued on, you know, it still continues on in Hollywood. But this was really, again, the marrying of these two, you know, kind of creative forces of the Pulp Fiction and mystery stories and this cinematic style that really brought, and it was about a 10-year period where most of these films were made, brought something very special to American culture. And it had a big influence on American culture. And we'll talk about that more when we look at some of the other movies. And interestingly, most of them were not made by Americans. Lots of them were made by Europeans, Billy Wilder, Otto Preminger, Carol Reed, of course, was English. But, you know, they really spoke to a sensibility in America at the time. And I find it really quite fascinating, you know, to think about that. Any last questions or?
Fred, just a couple more things to share with you. Both Ron and Ken had a similar question about the parts that were thrown out, the final scene. Is that
gas chamber scene?
Can you find that anywhere? Is it available?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, maybe, but I don't think so. In those days, remember, it was film, you know, and you know, the negative maybe exists somewhere, but, you know, unless it was printed and cut, and there weren't a lot of great archiving being done at the time. They didn't, you know, have the DVD director's cut that came out a year later or anything else like that. I'm sure you could find the script. It's very possible to me that you could find the screenplay of Double Indemnity, which would have that final scene at the gas chamber. But and remember, that was very much, you know, in a way, what influenced this from the beginning when James Cain, you know, as a newspaper reporter, attended this execution. And it was quite controversial and quite a big, there was a lot of publicity about it at the time. But no, I'm not sure it exists anywhere else.
And two more that we can fit in here.
Oh, sure.
Elva Rogers was so riveted by the language. One line I'll never forget is the correlation between the scent of honeysuckle and murder.
Yeah. And sweet smell of honeysuckle. That's one of the most famous lines, of course. And it's not just, they don't just say it once. They say it twice. You know, that honeysuckle, you know, will remind him of murder. How can you do that? Now, of course, you know, if you've lived in LA, and I lived in LA, it is true. There are these incredible, and jasmine and honeysuckle and all of these wonderful things. But you know, again, so many of these great lines. You know, again, you know, when Walter first met, I was thinking about that dame upstairs and the way she had looked at me, and I wanted to see her again close, without that silly staircase between us. You know, and then of course that great banter. You can do better than that, can't you, baby? He calls her baby, right? Of course, you better try it again. Maybe if I come a little closer. How's this? Think you can do it now? Why don't you shoot again, baby? Don't tell me because you've been in love with me all this time, right? Oh, it's just amazing. I love it. I love it. I love it. You know, and you know, goodbye, baby was like his, you know, his final words, right, to her. You know, and so yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons I love watching it again and again. Is the dialogue is just so superb. And all from Raymond Chandler. And if you're not familiar with Raymond Chandler novels and you've only watched his movies, I highly recommend reading them. He was a great American writer. Again, these books were never considered great literature at the time, but there's always been this tradition of pop culture writers in America. And remember, these are very much following this whole mythology that really started back with James Fenimore Cooper, you know, and Daniel Boone. And there was always this idea of the anti-hero in American mythology, that the guy who has to go to the edge, you know, that, you know, who has to kind of go Indian to beat the Indians. And then you found it in the Western dime store novels with, you know, Wild Bill Hickok and all the great Western heroes. And that all became ultimately these detectives, you know, and it continues today. And it's very unique. And I don't know that there's another culture besides America that has this very rich kind of literature that sits underneath their, you know, intellectual literature and really spoke to Americans. And of course, people read them like crazy. You know, I mean, it's not unique. You know, there were, of course, these magazines that everybody bought. And that's how Charles Dickens published his, you know, novels. You know, these were serialized in the paper. So it's not unique to America in terms of this popular form of literature, but it's really is interesting how you can track the progression of these characters. And then, of course, it all got rediscovered again, you know, with the anti-heroes of the late 60s and early 70s and the, you know, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and things like that. It's quite interesting. And anyhow, I really appreciate all of you joining us. Next week, we have an incredible movie called Laura that was directed by Otto Preminger, who's this fantastic director, and another kind of mystery romance plot with Gene Tierney and Dana Andrews. And please watch it, and we'd love to talk more about that one and hear your questions, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that fit into this whole genre. And one other thing I would ask of everybody is, as you know, we provide all of these film talks and film clubs and online programming for free. But needless to say, the Westdale is struggling, you know, as you can imagine, being closed. We have no revenue at the time. We're very fortunate. We have some support from the government, and there's some grants and different things that are, you know, keeping us alive. And we'll make it through this you know, through this year and be there for, you know, another 50 years. Because, of course, you know, we did this heritage restoration of the building, and it'll always be there. But anything you can do to help support us would be greatly appreciated. And if you go to the westdale.ca, you'll see easy ways to donate and help us out. So anything you can do would be great.
Great, thanks. Wonderful talk tonight. And to those of you that attended, thanks so much. We look forward to seeing you at Laura next Monday night.
And thank you very much, Jeff, for all your help. I know it's sort of a cockamamie way we're trying to do this with showing the slides, but I hope for the audience it was helpful. And it's helpful for me to have an image to talk to and to help emphasize the point I'm trying to make.
I'm having a blast, Fred, having a good time. Great to spend time, like, you know, with like-minded individuals. The only thing I can say is after watching the last 5 Film Noir, I'm walking around the house narrating a lot.
That's true.
Don't call your wife Dame, by the way, tonight. Just
I don't know how baby would work anymore these days either. Okay, bye everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.